Welcome back, WNST, Tassel, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We positively have a full house tonight. We have been promising full election coverage with our merger from the WNST sports brand over to Baltimore Positive. All of our sponsors are involved. I had some crab cakes at Fadley's last week. We're still shipping those crab cakes everywhere. I actually dined at El Guapo, the new Latin flair in the Ville, and I dined with Jeff Moeller of Moeller and Gary Realty, so I'm giving him a shout out as well. And of course, Evan and everybody at State Fair moving across the street, opening up good vibes with my Latin roots at El Guapo. And to celebrate Don Moeller, I know you'll appreciate this because there's about 7 people in the Zoom tonight. I'm going to do more shutting up and more drinking of the leftover margaritas they left me at El Guapo the other night. Look, this is your baby. ElectionPalooza is your thing. I just stole the logo off the internet. I want to give you full oxygen to let everybody in here and talk about how this whole thing came together. If they're unfamiliar with it, it's a little bit like Hollywood Squares with drinks and Donald Trump.
And today, and Ryan gets to be Paul Lind. But we have a great guest, as always. We have our regulars, Candace Dodson-Reed and Tom Cole from Elevate, Maryland. Ryan Miner from the spectacular Miner Detail. Malia Cromer, professor at Goucher College and the director of the Sarah T. Hughes Field Politics Center. And we're delighted to welcome back another veteran of Baltimore Positive, Lucinda Ware, the Deputy Director of Policy and Campaign in the Democracy Division for the ACLU, and recently the National Political Director for Amy Klobuchar. So we're going to get it right from the campaign trail tonight in ElectionPalooza III. So welcome, everybody. And Malia, let's just jump right in with you, because recently you were out in the field. You did a huge poll. It had 3 parts. Why don't you sort of walk us through? I have one question for you before you walk us through it. Okay. And, it's always Nestor's favorite thing. And each one of your polls, it talked about, had a 90% chance of having a margin of error, and I'm paraphrasing, of 3.1%. So I want you to tell our listeners, we love it when you do the 4 dummies version, as to what 95% chance of favorability that it'll have a 3.1% margin of error. Tell us what that means in regular speak.
Sure. This is, I guess, my favorite way to explain this. What you're talking about is the science behind random sampling. And so the Goucher poll doesn't just interview 1,000 people. We interview 1,000 randomly sampled Marylanders. And because we use traditional telephone polling, which is a dual frame with landlines and cell phones, now the Goucher poll is almost primarily a cell phone poll. That's because cell phones are the primary mode that folks use phones on. They have a really strong coverage rate across the state. We're picking up in the upper 90s. Individuals have the ability to be selected into the sample. And because everybody has that equal probability of being sampled in, you can then draw a random sample from those individuals and then make inferences about the population at large. So what I can tell you is that if I drew this sample 100 times, 95 out of 100 times, I would be confident that the results I found would fall into the margin of error, which is associated with the sample size. For this survey, we start at 1,002 Marylanders. With that breaks out to a margin of sampling error about 3.1%. So just think about the numbers and then bound them by plus or minus 3.
Now, do I, and again, the rest of our guests jump in at any time with questions for any of us, for Malia. Malia, when I look, and we'll have you talk about the presidential race first, because that's front and center with everybody as we go to tape this. We're about 3 weeks out. You have the race at 61 Biden, 30 Trump. With that 3.1 sampling error, when people look at that, then does that mean that hypothetically Biden could be 58 and Trump could be 33? Is that the simple way to say it?
Yes. So just think about the number and then do plus or minus on either side. And so that's the best way to look at it. I guess the suggestion I always give to folks that are writing headlines for the media, that if you have a race that it's like 51-49, and the margin of error is 4%, you can't say whether somebody's up or down. You say that the race is tied, because that's what you can discern from that information. But in this case, in Maryland, it is very safe to say that Joe Biden is ahead. I don't think that there's no real doubt in this situation.
Any surprises to you on the national level when you polled? Were you surprised by the margin of error? Was it about where you would have anticipated? Um, what what were your observations there?
Well, listen, I think that we're on track to have a historic victory for Joe Biden here in Maryland. And historic in terms of the last time was when LBJ beat Goldwater by this margin. So that was like the real story, is like whether Joe Biden is able to best Donald Trump in Maryland by historic margin. I think the underlying number that most people thought was interesting was the mail-in balloting versus the voting in person. And that's because it's part of that larger national story about the partisan differences in terms of your ballot preference. Maryland, just like the rest of the United States, has a sharp partisan division. Democrats are far more likely than their Republican counterparts to say that they're going to cast their ballot by mail-in, and Republicans are far more likely than Democrats to say that they're going to vote in person, either on election day or early voting. And that's obviously, I think, a reflection of the national conversation. You have a Republican president who has consistently called mail-in ballots fraudulent and warned people against using them. And then you see Republicans shying away from using mail-in ballots. And on the other hand, our Democratic leaders here in the state have been standing really strongly behind the use of mail-in ballots. And you can see that then reflected in people's voter preferences.
Well, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I was just going to ask. So we had you on the show on Elevate Maryland not so long ago, and there's an important thing I want you to address, because I'm hearing it from a lot of my friends as they are looking at the polls across various states, across national polls, and they're saying, well, the polls were wrong last time, and you would address that, and it's not necessarily true. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind. I know you probably answered the question 100 times.
Yes.
But it's ElectionPalooza, so we're talking about this one.
Okay, so I will give you the answer that all pollsters have given to this. So yes, there certainly were some problems in 2016. There were some state level polls that were off, and they were off more than the margin of error should have accounted for. That being said, all the national polling really did indicate correctly that it would be a Clinton victory. But I think that there's been a problem with people conflating election forecasting with election polling. So election forecasters are the individuals who are out saying before the Clinton loss to Trump that she had a 95% chance of victory, a 90% chance of victory. Does not mean that's what the polls were necessarily saying. Most of the polls in those key swing states showed a significant tightening between the two. So they showed the race getting narrower and narrower as election day came. In some places, for example, Florida, a lot of those really what we would call gold standard polls, which were the live caller polls like ours, that have a really strong track record, showed Trump pulling within the margin of error. And effectively, he beat the margin of error in a lot of these key swing state polls that it could have really went either way. And I think it's also important to go back and look. I mean, this is an election that was decided by a relative handful of votes in a few states. So everybody likes to blame pollsters. Everybody likes to dismiss polls because of 2016. But they also don't want to talk about how 2018, nearly every single important poll predicted the blue wave that was coming. So people never want to talk about 2018, but they can't forget about 2016 for some reason.
Yeah. So is it really that people should be paying attention to these statewide polls and less to these national polls that have, Biden up by 17 points?
So the national polls are really important for you to see the underlying demographic characteristics of the electorate. And I think it points to national trends. You can test some national messages. Obviously, we have an electoral college. We don't have a popular vote, so the statewide polling is most important. And I say what's really important, and this is something that has happened since 2016, is that you've seen a stronger investment in statewide polling. So these large national media organizations should stop beating up on state pollsters and start funding polling done at the state level. And I got to give a lot of credit to Nate Cohen at the Upshot, because they have actually been funding a lot of these statewide polls in areas like that have never really get polled before. I mean, they're not going to come to Maryland just because, our 8 electoral votes and, because it's the 30-point gap.
Before we jump to part 2 of your poll, I want to stay on national issues, and I want to jump to our national expert. I think looking around, she's the only one that was out there slogging through the Midwest and trying to win the nomination for her candidate. Lucinda, I know you're still piped into that world. Couple of questions. Did Trump make a serious strategic mistake up and down the ballot by demonizing mail-in vote? Did he put Republicans at a disadvantage? And then second part of the question I want to throw to you, Lucinda, is give us, I know you're talking to folks out there in the Midwest, give us what it feels like out there on the ground right now.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Glad to be here. You know, I think that first question, Don, is kind of hard. Republicans are very loyal to the Republican Party, right? And they stand firm. And I have noticed that very much in the Midwest, right? I mean, the Midwest it's a solid mix of conservative and moderate and liberal. It probably leans a little bit more conservative and moderate than the liberal piece, but it's a solid mix. But it's hard to say. I think we really won't know that answer until after the election. And what I am intrigued, and I think many political operatives are, is determining if Republicans, and we will see if Republicans are going to stand firm in their loyalty to their party and to Trump, or how many will move more to the left or move more to the middle and say enough is enough. And he has damaged our party and he has damaged our country. And this go round on this election cycle, I can't stand with him. But historically, that's not what Republicans do. So it's hard for me to answer that first question. I'm not quite sure. And then the second question, I mean, it's all about the Midwest. I'm really, really intrigued to see what happens in Wisconsin. Right? We call it flyover country for a reason. I think the coasts continue to forget the vote and the power and the influence that comes nationally and even on the state level and locally from the Midwest. And I think every presidential election, I like to see and find out what candidates and which campaigns really invest in Midwestern states. Now more than ever, here we are again in 2020, and the Midwest is going to determine a lot in this presidential cycle. And again, for me, I think out of all the states that we're thinking about, Wisconsin's really big, Michigan's really big.
Michigan, yeah.
Well, let's frame it, Lucinda. Let me jump in there, and I want you to keep going, but I want to frame it for our listeners. And again, if you're just joining in, Nestor says, I'm notoriously bad at redoing this. So let me try to reset. This is ElectionPalooza III. We've got Candace Dodson-Reed and Tom Cole from Elevate, Maryland. Ryan Miner from A Minor Detail. Malia Cromer, the director of the Sarah T. Hughes Field Politics Center at Goucher College. And fresh off the Amy Klobuchar campaign, Lucinda Ware. We're talking about the Midwest. To reset for folks out there who are in their car driving around, listening in their dens, wherever. A couple of things that we know right now, and Malia gets back to your bailiwick, that the real clear politics average in those Midwestern states now has Pennsylvania at 7, Michigan at 7, Wisconsin at 6.3. So 3 weeks out, fairly substantial. I mean, not a lead that cannot be overcome, but fairly substantial. But to go back to what you said earlier, Lucinda, so our listeners can get this image in their head, how close the last election was. In Michigan, Hillary Clinton lost by 11,000 votes. Barack Obama won Michigan 4 years earlier by 450,000 votes. Somehow the Clinton campaign lost 460,000 votes. Pennsylvania, 44,000. Obama won that by 310,000. So the Obama campaign lost a couple 100,000 votes there. And in Wisconsin, Hillary lost by 23,000, a state that Obama had won by 213,000 votes. So obviously, razor-thin margins. You know it. Your senator that you worked for was from there. Lucinda, talk to us. You lived out there in the Midwest. Talk to us about the Midwest voter. What do they care about? What's important to them? How do you connect and resonate with them?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things that I learned about, and that I was often reminded in regards to the Midwest, right? We're talking about heavy agriculture, right? Communities, farm, manufacturing. This isn't necessarily big city, East Coast living, so to speak. And so there is a value to small business, and there is a value to farm and agriculture. I think the environment is crucial. I saw this a lot in Iowa. the effects of climate change and the change that is happening in the environment is affecting the Midwest. Especially you see it with flooding and you see it with erosion of a lot of the farmland and agriculture. And I think those issues are super, super important. And then of course, just economic development in general, which ties into a little bit of these two other issues, but is huge. I mean, businesses, Fortune 500 companies, large institutions and organizations have not necessarily, and we've seen this over the years, have not settled in and have gone back to rebuild and establish themselves in Midwest communities. I think companies and organizations are trying overall, but it's not what we see on the East Coast for various reasons. And so I think those issues really stand out when you also think of moral and kind of religious character and values, which are really big. You know, Midwesterners, it's still very family oriented, right? When I was in the Midwest, I wasn't living in communities or going in communities that had high populations and rates of people who were single or working professionals. I would say higher ed and education and degree, those rates weren't necessarily high either, as we see here, like on the East Coast or in DC and Northern Virginia and in the East Coast in general. And so I think that Midwesterners want to make sure that they're being heard and that people are valuing their contribution to this country. And without manufacturing and farming and agriculture, what are we going to do? And we're seeing the impacts with COVID now, right? When we think about when we're going to the grocery stores and the shelves are empty, and you think about meat and fruit and produce, right? And how difficult it's been to be able to function here in COVID. You know, we can all directly tie that back to the West Coast and Midwest and farming. And so those issues are super important. And agriculture and again, environment, I think really stand out the most.
One of the things that
Can I
I
also
wanted
toss out one? Oh.
No, go ahead, Candace. Go ahead.
Candace
No,
and
I
then
was just going
Nestor.
to say, sure. So I was also going to toss out one thing that we have to think about when we're looking at the numbers from the last election to this election. And that is the thing that I always bring up is we went from a Black president, right, to Trump. And there were certain things that Trump did on the campaign trail to, and I'd love to hear the rest of the folks' opinion on this, to, you know, to signal a certain type of voter who may have been frustrated with the demographics that were in the White House at the time. And I think, you know, we have to think about that when we look at the numbers and think about how Trump came into power and still the message that he sends currently related to this same issue. And so I'd love to hear from everybody about that piece of it as well, because that is an underlying piece that we sometimes don't talk about when we're looking at the big difference between the Clinton numbers and the Obama numbers.
Well, one of the things I was
Nestor
going to
and
throw
then
out into Lucinda's conversation, and certainly to where Ryan, and we talked about this, Ryan and I have talked about this at length, and in being in a Republican-dominated area. As we sit here talking about Maryland going to win going away for Biden, and it's not even a conversation. In the places where it is a conversation, I find it fascinating that the Lincoln Project and Republicans, and never Trumpers, I guess as they're deemed at this point, would be outspoken because they really are the hope, right? Like the Democrats, for the most part, are going to go with Biden because it's what they do. As you've pointed out, how hardcore the Republican base is for Republicanism, that it doesn't matter, and Trump could shoot somebody out in the middle of Fifth Avenue, they'd still vote for him. It's the in-betweens to me, or the peel-offs, the people who voted for Obama who don't necessarily vote for Democrats, or people who voted for Trump that maybe had no allegiance to Republicanism or Republicans, but as maybe you pointed out, Candace, maybe maybe racism was involved and you can't win them back. But for the people that can be won back, what the Lincoln Project's doing, and what people that are trying to find that person in the middle, or that really pissed off Republican voter who's pissed off enough to vote for Joe.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in, folks. First of all, it's an honor to be on with Lucinda and Dr. Cromer, who I admire and love reading her polls. And I get them and I wait up until about 12:01 to read them.
He's not lying.
Don't we all?
So I want to say, first of all, I'm actually in Florida right now, and I'm in Charlotte County, Florida. Don't tell anyone.
Tell us where Charlotte County is, which part of the state.
We're about a half an hour, 45 minutes north of gosh, I don't know. We're about an hour north of Naples.
Okay.
But we're on the
You're
Gulf.
right near my mother-in-law. Tell her I said hello.
So you're on the West Coast.
Yes. Have you ever heard of Punta Gorda? That's where
Okay.
we're about 6 miles away from there. And we drove through 6 states, so Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida on Saturday and Sunday. We stayed in Savannah, beautiful place. And as I was driving down, I was looking at the different signage, and we're in a very culturally conservative area. And I had lots of conversations, and I'm staying at my mother-in-law's house right now, and there's a lot of really pro-Trump people here, neighbors adjacent to us, all around us. And some of the conversations that I'm having is there is nothing that this man will do to eliminate them from voting for him. And as to Candace's point, I think Donald Trump is truly the last vestige of the hanger-oners who say, this is my country. And by that, they mean this is a white country. They want to hang on to that feeling. They want to hang on to that thought to say, we do not believe in immigration. We don't necessarily believe in the cultural diversification. We don't believe in what is going to end up inevitably happen in maybe 15 to 20 years is where white guys like myself, we're going to become the minority. It's going to be a majority country. Donald Trump, for whatever reason they hold on to, is that last best hope for holding on to what they think America truly is. And it's a enclave of where they feel most comfortable. And that's around people who look like them, who think like them, who talk like them, and who have, who are educated like them. And sadly, and I don't know what's going to happen in Florida, but I can tell you that where we are, this is probably going to go Trump. But Donald Trump is not just a person. He is an idea. And that idea is that they must remain beholden to this idea that America cannot be different from them, how they think and what they look like.
Spot on, Ryan.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
I
it's
mean,
sad.
I love that
on.
you think it's the
Spot
last
on.
vestiges, though. I
I do too.
I don't know it's the last vestiges. I'm a little bit concerned about what comes next when there is not an organizing force, and a lot of these concerns and interests persist. I think that he is a representative of them. But what comes next? Hopefully we get the opportunity to ask that question, but I don't think they're going anywhere.
Yeah, I saw John Meacham recently, and Nestor knows I have a man crush on John Meacham, and he
Until he said
up,
no to the show, but that's only
Until he
temporary.
said no.
That's only temporary.
We were on the 1 yard line. We were on the 1 yard line with John Meacham, and I puffed out my chest too far, and then we got side. But he also had to get sidetracked from the Pratt, so I felt a little better because of his schedule. He's a little busy right now. But I think he would agree, Tom, with Ryan, and what he was indicating is that he does think this is sort of the last gasp of a generation who, when they talk about, and this gets to what Candace was saying, when they talk about take the country back, we know what they mean, and we'll get into presidential and vice presidential debates shortly. But picking up on this cultural issue, Malia, it gets into part 2 of your poll, and which I characterize part 2 is the Hogan part and the police reform part. And I'm going to preface it, excuse me, I may have said this the last time we were together, and I think this is borne out in your poll, and I'm going to tee it up for you this way. If you would have told me that 10 or 15 years ago, that in Catonsville, Maryland, that I view as really, and Candace, you know it well, really a bellwether, Lucinda, you know it well, a bellwether kind of an area. It's about, when I think of it, it's about as purpley as it gets. It's got some pockets of progressives. It's got a lot of moderates. It's got a lot of what I'll call the Wall Street Republicans. And it's an area that you sort of you get to take the temperature, I guess I'll say, of the state. Well, if you'd have told me 10 or 15 years ago that for the past 5 or 6 months, you would have trouble finding a street in Catonsville that did not have at least one, maybe more than one, Black Lives Matter or matter is the minimum signs all throughout Catonsville, I would have said, you must be in another community. I'm not sure people are willing to wear that on their sleeve. That's where we are right now. We're at a place where a local elementary school, where parents came forward and put art on outside of the building for the entire summer, making that statement. And Malia, that gets to your poll, which I think showed in the state itself some overwhelming support, both for police reform and Black Lives Matter. So walk us through that.
Sure. So I tried to frame our poll on the discussions that the working group in the Maryland General Assembly was having. So we do have like several different questions that gauge those topics. But in terms of just of Black Lives Matter as a movement, what we've seen from national polls over the summer was a peak in support. Across racial lines, you see finally white Americans expressing above 50% a favorable view of the Black Lives Matter movement. Support among Black Americans has always been there, but it's white Americans that finally you see the uptick happening, and that was obviously after the murder of George Floyd this summer, and all the demonstrations and protests really, I think, drove at least finally the awakening that you really needed to see for a movement that is just about racial justice. And then, so we've never asked about this in Maryland before. We asked about it this time. And what you see is, I mean, I think reflective of what you're talking about in Catonsville, is that a majority of Marylanders hold a favorable view of the Black Lives Matter movement. The level of favorability is higher among Black Marylanders than white Marylanders, but we're at a point now that more than 50% of white Marylanders are expressing support. And that's a good place to be for a movement, because the idea of trying to adjust some of the systemic issues that have been facing the criminal justice system along racial lines, you have to have that support there to hopefully push it through the General Assembly. I would say now more than ever, there is an appetite to do real police reform from the public, and it's going to be up to the General Assembly to see how far they're willing to take it, or what the advocates and the lawmakers, how they'll shape that policy.
Malia, your poll also showed something else. And again, everybody jump in here. I was struck by it, and I'll call it the "we can walk and chew gum at the same time" philosophy. You found an almost identical number of Marylanders expressing a favorable opinion of police, as did Black Lives Matter. So they didn't see it as an either or. The way I read your poll was they were saying, look, I can be supportive of police. At the same time, I think we need reform because there's some bad guys and gals in police departments and some things we need to address. But overall, I feel pretty good about cops, and I also am supportive of this movement. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Well, no, I mean, I think when you think about the police reforms, the reforms themselves aren't anti-police. The reforms themselves are reforming the police. And that's the heart of what they're trying to do here. These are not necessarily anti-police measures. And the Black Lives Matter movement isn't an anti-police movement. It's a pro-racial justice movement.
Right.
And so, yes, those two things can happen at the same time. There's no reason why they can't. And actually, the fact that we've gotten to that point, I think, is really important.
And
the genius of the end, right? Like, it's the genius of the end versus the tyranny of the or. Like,
so I guess I might be coming into a little bit of disagreement with my partner, but I don't think so. And I'm certainly not responding or disagreeing with anything Malia said. But what I do want to comment on when we're saying that, we've kind of reached this new plateau of equity and consensus around these things is that Candace and I operate and live in a very progressive jurisdiction, Howard County. And I can guarantee you that when it comes to subjects and I would say concepts of racial equity and inclusion, they would agree. But once it actually came time to start to implement those ideals, that's when the support started to fall off. And so I think Malia correctly polled this issue. I think she's absolutely right. And in my, amateur lay reading of her poll results that this is the moment to strike. But I think we might also agree that once this becomes legislation and once it starts going through and once you have the police unions say don't do this, as they've done in jurisdictions all across the country, maybe that walking and chewing gum results in people sitting down and deciding whether or not they're going to walk or chew gum.
Well, I
Yeah,
want
no,
to.
I mean, I don't think we disagree. I think we're, we're generally on the same page for sure. I've said over and over again, it's one thing to march in a protest or an uprising and hold up your Black Lives Matter signs. It's another thing to actually advocate for policies and initiatives that work to change the issues that we faced as a country for 400 years, right? Like, there's two different things. I don't think it has to be mutually exclusive. Like, you can do both.
Right.
You also have, respect for good police officers, and also want to look at how we, and defund is the word that everybody goes crazy over, but like how we advocate for resources that support things beyond policing, right? And so, I think you can do both. Whether or not we're there in Howard County or in the state, I'm not sure, but you should be able to do both.
Ryan, you were trying to jump in.
Oh, yes, sir. So many good points. And I want to understand from everyone else's perspective is that I think that the way to talk openly and honestly about these issues, unfortunately, it does have to come down to marketing and about how these ideas are marketed. I'm a strong proponent of the racial justice movement. However, the Republicans are sometimes brilliantly so, I think, not at their own credit, that when they say, well, defund the police, that scares people. I can tell you that's going to scare someone, an average voter up in Hagerstown, Maryland. It's going to scare somebody. They don't want to defund the police, but they do want to fundamentally overhaul police practices. At least they're willing to admit it, I think, at this juncture. And whether that's progress or not, I think that's for everyone to decide. But how do we address these issues incrementally, and how will they affect this election? Because you hear it all the time from the right. Black Lives Matter, it's a terrorist organization. No, it's not. No, it's not. You don't understand what Black Lives Matter means, so therefore you want to call it something that you want to make people afraid of it. And that's how you win elections. So,
well, see, I would suggest, Ryan, in response to your question, and Lucinda again, jump in as the person that was out there. We're going to find out in a couple of weeks, and it will be important to my mental health how we answer this question. Just, yeah, Nestor's holding up, vote.
Yeah, right here. I mean, this is the referendum. It's in my hand, literally.
If this doesn't go the way that I think it needs to go, I'll probably be in a fetal position past the first of the year, and you all probably have to come get me.
Just so everyone knows, his son is legitimately worried about him. He told me this at El Guapo.
And my son has a right to be worried about me, as does my daughter and my wife.
Once he got the third margarita, he got a little happier. He thought, but I don't think that's going to fix things.
Well, they're right to be worried, because I think it's the most consequential election in my lifetime, without a doubt. Yes. But here's what I think, Lucinda, and I hope you don't throw a wet blanket on it. I think that the president particularly, and we'll jump back to part 3 with Malia shortly, but the president particularly, I think, has overplayed the racism card. Now, we're going to find out, but everything that I see when I look inside the crosstabs of these polls that come out, and I look at people over 65 and suburban women that the president was trying to tell them, be very afraid because black people are coming to your neighborhood, when their neighbor next door and their son were in the same soccer league and just went to have a pizza party to celebrate the end of baseball season or whatever it was. I don't think suburban women were particularly worried about black folks coming to their neighborhood, and I think they were appalled. And I guess, again, I'll turn to you as our political guru. Is my optimism warranted based on what you're hearing from out there on the trail?
Yes and yes and no, and I don't know. I mean, maybe they were not worried until Trump said it, but they still did not want individuals that didn't look like them in their neighborhoods, right? And that is just the reality of where we were in this country, and maybe we thought that we weren't there. I mean, I'm born and raised in Howard County. That's how Candace and I know each other so well. And that is something that I have seen traveling around the United States. I mean, you can't be living in this country right now on some level, and I hope, and not feel uncomfortable, right? The question is, or for me, what I wonder is do I think that people are going to go vote in November, and what's going to motivate them to vote against Trump is the Black Lives Matter movement? I don't know necessarily. It may be for me, it may be for some people, but ultimately I still think COVID is what moves those white suburban moms more than it does than them being concerned by my cousin or my uncle or a spouse or a friend that looks like me that is a part of the Black and brown community. I think that it has opened the door for conversation, and it's been wonderful to see the non-Black and brown communities step outside of their comfort level and understand that a conversation needs to be had, and maybe take a hat and maybe look in the mirror and reevaluate how they are feeling. But we still have a long way to go in terms of fully stepping into a place where we can be standing side by side at any rally, and then also turn around and go and vote and make sure that you're voting in a way that is supportive of these social justice issues. And so I still don't know yet. And I am waiting to see what the case may be. I mean, it's one thing to say and support the Black Lives Matter movement or any movement, but it's another thing not to support special investigations on these issues, or to have police chiefs and mayors resign who have been on the wrong side or making, poor decisions when it comes to these social justice issues. And that's the other component that we're seeing to this, where we don't have movement and change. That's equally important in trying to move forward. So it's hard for me to answer that question, Don.
Malia, I want to jump back. Go ahead. You're gonna jump in anyway, but I want you, when you do, to talk about COVID.
No, I'll talk about COVID in a second, but I want to address, I think Tom's point is really important about the relationship between sort of public policy and public opinion. And yes, you see this a larger support for Black Lives Matter than we have seen historically, but that certainly doesn't solve all of our problems. And you're right, there's a real rubber hits the road when it turns into general attitudes towards race, expressing those sorts of attitudes, and then actually implementing it in terms of public policy. My argument is that it looks to me now that some of these very specific public policy issues, you're seeing large swaths of support from Marylanders. And if lawmakers who definitely do care about public opinion, this is the time to at least try to move the ball forward. And we'll see. And you're exactly right. So once the legislative process happens, that's when things start to get messy. All of a sudden, It's not this really clean, rosy picture. It's the reality of what the process looks like.
That's right.
But what I'm saying is, at least our numbers at least indicate that there are some certainly incremental changes that could happen through legislative process now. And those changes now really do affect people's everyday lives, especially people of color. And so that's why it's important that even if you're not getting everything you want, even if the reality doesn't even match the rosier picture that perhaps some of the polling, my poll and then some national pollings have painted, if you use it to at least move the ball incrementally, it certainly is a win. Because it's going to take a long time to reform policing issues, not just in Maryland, but in this country.
But again, I think you can look. Go ahead, Candace.
I was just going to say, I'm going to say one more time. That was great that you were out there with your Black Lives Matter sign. And it was great you were holding it up loud and proud. And it's great that you have it in your yard. What are you actually doing to implement policy? And there are some elected officials who were doing that. And I hope that we see something different, particularly in Howard County, calling on them to do something different. But we've seen it across the state. Don't hold up the sign and then not look at policies, initiatives.
That's right.
Change.
Candace is right.
I think it's really important. That's why, again, I'll pick Baltimore County, a county that I know quite well. And that's why I tip my hat to County Executive Johnny Olszewski and Councilman Jones, who did the hard work. Johnny started with an executive order, got the discussion started. Councilman Jones came in and asked to up the ante, and working together, they got 6 out of 7 council members to pass pretty significant change legislation, particularly in a place that's traditionally moderate to conservative as Baltimore County. So I think you're correct in that it has to be proven out in policy, but I think that we're beginning to see support at the grassroots level that allows leaders like County Executive Olszewski and then Councilman Jones and others to move forward and bring about real change. And the next step, and again, in Baltimore County, they were actually able to get the FOP to support some of the changes. That was welcome as well. So we still have miles to go, but I think we're starting to see incremental change. Now, Malia, you did ask COVID. Everybody's indicated. Lucinda, everybody else. COVID is on the ballot, and you went to the people of Maryland. And we'll finish up your polling segment in a minute with Larry Hogan, who continues to find the brass ring in the Sarah T. Hughes poll. I'm sure he loves he probably has them all framed. But COVID, you tried to dig down and find out how it was affecting people. What'd you learn about COVID?
The picture of him framing the Goucher poll is one that will stick with me.
Well, he's got to, right? When you're 71% approval rating, it hangs right up over his.
It was on Facebook today. It was definitely.
There
on
you
Facebook.
go. See,
was it? Yeah.
I'm telling you, I guarantee you, Mike Ritchie's got it. They've wallpapered it down there. It's their new screenshot. We'll get back to Larry Hogan. Tell us about COVID.
Yeah.
Very serious topic.
Just really quick, I guess, really quickly with COVID. The contentious issue certainly has been reopening. And I will tell you that our poll found very little support for individuals who are like in the reopen crowd who want to quickly reopen everything. People think we're on the right pace. So the majority of Marylanders say right pace for reopening. Those folks that are like the too quickly or too slowly crowd, you can see that falls almost neatly among party lines. There are some Democrats who say, we've been opening too quick, and Republicans say no, too slow. But most people fall in that middle ground. And I think the most important thing of all of our COVID findings is the scariest part of the COVID findings is the division on whether you would take a vaccine. And that to me is we asked about vaccines way back in 2015, and an overwhelming majority of Marylanders were like, yes, vaccines prevent illness. We're pro-vaccine. And now you see this division, and the division's political.
I'm going to ask you, hey, Malia, I'm going to put you on the spot. I feel bad doing this. You may not have it at your fingertips. Can you remember roughly, I didn't know that piece of data you just shared, that you polled that in 2015. Yes. Can you remember roughly the breakdown in 2015?
Oh, it was in like the 90%.
Wow.
It was ridiculous. It was like whether you thought vaccines were effective at preventing disease was a very easy agree-disagree question. And vaccines or the safety of vaccines is not like it. That's most Americans believe in the safety of vaccines. Like, and the anti-vaccination crowd is a very small minority movement. That's why it's sort of jarring to see.
Well, this is a Trump question. This is do you believe that Donald Trump would give you a vaccine after he told you to put bleach in yourself and take, fish medication, that's meant for lupus patients, so months later, the notion that I'm going to put something that he recommended into my body, I don't think so. And I wanted to turn the conversation a little bit toward the other things that we're talking about in regard to what's happening in Washington, D.C., which are all of these elections where all this money's been thrown in to form better policy and different policies other than what we've been subjected to all week, which is the Supreme Court thing that's going on right now while we're trying to figure out how we can get Congress to work for our country. This ballot, again, in a lot of states is going to be a big issue. And if to me it's not as big as Trump, but it's certainly 1A. If that's one, this is 1A, right?
I would just make the argument that the vaccine thing is probably one of the more important findings, not just here but nationwide. We're going to be in a situation where when you have that sort of lack of faith in government and our institutions, that suggests to me like a serious rot of the system. And that's really troubling. So that to me is a canary in the coal mine, really problematic finding when you see half of Marylanders say that they would not take it's specified in the question, an FDA approved vaccine.
Who's running the FDA, right?
Well, see, that does get back
I understand that, but I'm saying that's why this question is, I think, very, very important.
Oh, I think it's a critical question. It led the news tonight. I happened to watch the news before I came up here. I had the 5 o'clock news on, and that particular finding, Malia, in your poll, you were on talking about it. That was one of the lead stories. But I think it absolutely gets back to Nestor's point, which is when we try to clear out the rubbish and we try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again of all of the horrific things that this president has done, and you just put it in public health terms, Malia, I don't think any will have longer lasting effects than his ability to destroy confidence in mainstream organizations and norms in the United States, whether it be the FBI, the CIA, the
media,
FDA, the CDC, the media. He has tried to convince his base, that 40 to 42%, that everything that is traditionally part of the United States establishment is going to hell in a handbasket, and that includes vaccines. And I would suggest that Nestor's right. That's what's reflected in your polls.
I do think that's where I think that, and that's the problem. So we should that's the fundamental problem, that we should not be politicizing things like vaccines. And it's a scary world that we're in, where public health has been politicized. And
did you guys all see the graphic
any...
floating on Twitter of the blue state beginning and then the red floated up on the Twitter chart? I shared it earlier. It was in regard to the states and their ability to deal with COVID, which obviously the beginning it was Maryland and New York, and it was blue. It was blue states. Then all of a sudden the red came on after July, and this is all public policy in telling those people in those states that you don't need a mask and everything's cool, when obviously it's not.
Now, Nestor, on Sunday night, my wife and I walked into a pizza shop right around the corner from my mother-in-law's house. We had our masks on. We walked in, and the young man standing at the counter was shocked, and he looked at both of us like we had 6 foreheads. And we went to order, and he just said, I don't know why you're wearing your mask. And my wife looked at him, and she goes, well, first of all, my mother-in-law is in a skilled nursing rehab center right now. I'm high risk with asthma. And I looked at him, and I said, we're from Maryland, and we wear our masks. And he said, well, our governor said we didn't have to. And I said, your governor is an idiot. And I said, and he's like, well, we're at 100% capacity. He goes, you could take it off if you want. To your point, what has been done to our country is it is an intentional, fundamental belief that our institutions cannot be trusted. And that is why Joe Biden, who is an institutionalist, can repair some of this. This damage is going to be prolonged for 5, 10, maybe 10 years beyond.
Yeah.
Our systems of government have been so demolished and demoralized. And when I hear and read that a certain percentage of people wouldn't take a vaccine, would they take it if Donald Trump told them to?
Oh, yes.
And would we take it if the president told us? Absolutely not.
No.
Well, we've all been watching the same movie for 4 years, allegedly, right?
And I think that gets us, Nestor, to the exhaustion factor, which is another reason why I'm, again, all the PTSD that I have from 2016, I'm a little more cautiously optimistic every day, because I think people are exhausted, and they'll just take a little normalcy and figure the rest of it out. I know we're coming up close to our time limit. Before we get out of here, I want to turn to the ladies. And I don't know if the other guys had the same reaction. I want to talk, no reason to talk about the presidential debate. That was there's only one person in America that thought that went well. And he now
that was 3 balconies and 2 COVIDs and 3 helicopter rides.
A couple of Mussolini moves ago. But the vice presidential debate was more recent. And I want to tell you what happened in my household and in my world. And then I want Candace and Lucinda and Malia to weigh in. My wife's very quiet normally and very reserved, the exact opposite of me, has very strong political beliefs, but doesn't usually get all involved. And we're watching the debate, and it probably was in the first 15 or so minutes. She's screaming at the TV, and she is furious at Mike Pence, and she's furious at Susan Page for not running up and punching Mike Pence, I think. My phone begins to blow up. My daughter is losing her mind over what she sees as Mike Pence's condescending view towards women, which actually motivated her to go on and write an outstanding blog in the last few days. And my daughter-in-law is blowing up, and then my phone's blowing up from my female friends. So I've got to tell you, when I'm watching, I didn't like Mike Pence for his policies. I don't like the Mike Pence smug, but I didn't have that same visceral reaction as a man, which says something about my insensitivity. I get it. So I want you all to talk as women who watched that debate. Were the women in my life overreacting, or did you have any kind of similar reaction?
No, they weren't overreaction. Can I make one little disclaimer? And I'm like the debaters, where I'm going back to something that was said before. I just want to add one little itty bitty asterisk to the vaccine conversation, and that is Black folks have a history with vaccines because of Tuskegee and because of what we know happened with Henrietta Lacks. And so I wonder how much that is playing into the poll numbers. And we can talk about that later, but I just wanted to throw that little bit of a caveat out as well. As far as Senator Harris, and everyone knows how I feel about Senator Harris, I think an interesting thing that I was watching as a Black woman is, there was much conversation before the debate that she was going to shred him, right? Lots of conversation about that. I'm sure she heard from all the pundits and journalists and everybody else who had that conversation. There's also a thin line that she has to walk as a Black woman, and we should just name it, where if she were to do what he did, or if she were to respond in a really negative way, she would be painted the aggressive Black woman, right? There's already been a ton of conversation about her being aggressive and wanting the presidency, and even from folks who were in Biden's campaign talking about, how aggressive she is, and before she became the VP nominee, right? And so I thought she did an amazing job. I just want to give her the kudos publicly on doing an amazing job at sort of threading that line that many of us have to thread. That being said, the way that he interrupted her, Vice President Pence interrupted her, the way that Susan Page did not control it, she tried, but failed in controlling how that conversation should have happened. The number of times he interrupted her and tried to speak over her was awful. And watching that as a woman, I was just like, this is kind of what we deal with. It's sad, but true. And to your point with, not noticing that as a man, like, I hope that men now are having that kind of conversation about how awful that was, and just watch it. Just watch a portion of it. It was awful. It was awful.
I think for him being on the stage, we don't see him come out much, right? Like, he's always been in the shadows. Don and I had an episode a year ago. A local reporter actually went out to Indiana, wrote a book on him, right?
Tom Lobianco.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I sort of assume things about him when he won't be in a room with a woman and all these things. But to see him be such a jerk on display for a couple hours. I mean, he's been in that seat for 4 years, and we haven't heard or seen much of him. If that was his coming out party for America to sort of re-up them, it was gross. It was gross for everybody, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo Candace's sentiments and remarks. I agree, and it's nothing new. But I also think that Mike Pence is in the Republican Party, and specifically the Trump administration and the campaign. I believe that the way that Mike Pence handled Senator Harris was intentional. I think it was part of their strategy. They wanted to try to invoke the angry Black woman, the angry Black female narrative. And unfortunately, it didn't work, but that was what they were trying to do. And I think that was part of their strategy. And I think that that is their strategy when it probably comes to most and all women who are smart and intelligent. They did it to Senator Clinton, former First Lady Hillary Clinton, in the last election cycle. I wasn't surprised to see it now. It happens often. It is something that Candace, Neil, and I deal with all the time. I can count on one man how many times a week a man speaks to me that way and walks off, and probably all of us, and thinks nothing of it. And he's married, and he has a daughter, and he has sisters, and he feels as though that he is respectful of women all the time, but in actuality, he's not. But I think this was part of the strategy for Senator Pence and for the campaign, and they wanted to paint her as the angry Black female.
Lucinda, how much of the conversation was that, and we're going to jump to Malia for her reaction to that as well. How much of that conversation was front and center with Senator Klobuchar as she prepared for debates?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, first off, I want to give a shout out to Senator Klobuchar, who did a fantastic job during the Supreme Court hearings, as always. That is the senator that I know and whose campaign that I joined. But you cannot be a female, a woman elected official in this country, or an operative, or any woman for that matter, that's in any position where you have to exercise an opinion and have that not be front and center when you are trying to contribute to whatever the environment is in front of you. And all of us have worked on campaigns before. And when you worked with women candidates, that is always up for conversation. It was the same case when I worked with Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake in Baltimore City. We spent a lot of time talking about how the mayor was going to address herself in tone when she was front and center at events and in front of press. And she's a fantastic woman, and she was a great politician. So it was a big part of our debate prep. It always will be and has been and will continue to be until people look at women equally and equitably. And so that we listen to our words and our brain and not be threatened by our gender.
Malia.
And it's worse for Black women. It's just worse for Black women.
How about on a college campus, Malia, as a female professor?
I think it's everywhere, and it's everywhere. And of course, it's on college campuses. These are learned behaviors that men learn all through the years, and they can get away with it. You try to correct it when you can, when you're teaching and when you're interacting with students. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to note that. So as much as it's a gender thing, it sits more at the intersection of race and gender. And I think it's really important that white women are cognizant of it, because it's not just gender.
That's right.
Thank you.
Don?
All right, go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, a long time ago, when I was still had an R next to my name, and many of you may or may not know this, I don't know, but I interned a summer for Mike Pence when he was a U.S. congressman from Indiana. I
did not know that.
I did not know that. I need another drink.
Yeah, you're up. Go.
I
Ryan
spent
Miner, go.
Well, I spent a summer with him and his team and his religious weirdos that he surrounds himself with. And Mike Pence's cheap dime store act, that Midwestern faux nice, it's nothing more than a greasy control power grab. Oof. It's the same reason why none of us we can't always put our finger on it, but none of us like Ted Cruz. Mm-hmm. It's that oozing smarm. It's the Ronald Reagan style impersonation, the low key religiosity. It's the nice neighbor that the church going family, that nice man next door. But when the front door shuts, he looks at his wife, Karen Pence, and says, "Can you believe the people who live next door? Can you believe the people who are moving in our neighborhood?" Mike Pence is fundamentally disgraceful. He is there to normalize something that should never be normal. And I hold him in a greater contempt than almost anybody in this administration, because he will forever be known and attached indelibly to this monster.
Wow.
Wow, Ryan.
That's a way. Well, as we well.
Thanks, Ryan.
We learned.
I told you I needed another drink.
There you go. Now we're going to close before we get back to Nestor. We'll work our way back to him with Candace's least favorite part of ElectionPalooza. But we're about 3 weeks out. We're going to jump around. It's time, guys, to begin putting the chips on the table. Where do we end up on November 3rd, or at least a couple weeks later?
We're doing the race to 270. Like I hate it.
Come on, Candace, you hate it. We're gonna let you go first.
I'm gonna punt this again, because I don't even want. I'm so nervous about the whole thing that I do not want to make any kind of predictions. I'm looking at the state polls. I'm feeling optimistic. I'm knowing the people who I know in Pennsylvania who are voting. That makes me feel optimistic. 17 points ahead across, in the nation on these national polls. Malia's polls, like all of that makes me feel good. And yet, no, I'm not making any predictions.
Lucinda, does Biden
I'll go.
Does Biden get north of 300 electoral votes?
Yes, I think it's going to be Biden. I think he gets north of 300 electoral votes, and I have a feeling, I hope that they're going to pull it off. And I just want to add that healthcare is also important to Midwesterners, and I can't feel like we can have this conversation and you can't say healthcare, which is always an issue. But yes, I think Biden pulls it out. I do.
Tom Cole, 3 weeks
Yeah, I think
out.
he gets north of 350. And I think one of the things that people are missing out on is that ballots are being cast right now.
That's right.
So the October surprises, and Nestor, you had that at the last ElectionPalooza, so you need to file that thing. You're making me nervous.
Have you voted? Tom wants to know if you voted.
So the true story is my wife and I have been discussing to have our plan, and we literally looked out the window. I live at the harbor, and my wife spotted the ballot box in front of Oriole Park. We're going to walk up and ceremoniously do it. So
Well,
just so
better
you
take a
know,
video,
I
because
have a
I'm with
plan.
Tom. We've seen
Take
that
a
damn
photo.
ballot. And
Oh, no. If I stop, hold on now. I haven't even opened it. If I stop holding it up and I mail it, I won't be able to hold it up anymore. So I want to hold it up. There's going to be a whole ceremony when I fill out that little Biden, hole in there. I'm going to do it all up.
Right. Tom sees a tsunami north of 350. Malaya, where are you? You're
I'm
our
with
pollster.
Candace. I'm 100 with Candace. You guys won't let 2016 let pollsters live down 2016. You might out of your mind think I'd make a sort of prediction like that.
Yes.
I'm with Tom. I'm going on record. I'm not going to pass like two of my favorite ladies in this show. I think it's a blue tsunami. I think they're going to be surprises. I think the Democrats win 6 or 7 Senate seats and take back the Senate. Ryan, before we jump to Nestor to take us out of here, give us your take. 3 weeks out.
I'm going to be a little bit more cynical and conservative in my predictions. I think that I think Biden loses Ohio. I think that he loses Florida, and I think he loses North Carolina. I do think he's going to win Michigan and Wisconsin, and I believe he has a very good shot at winning Arizona. I think it's going to be very tight. This thing will tighten even further. I don't think it's going to be a blowout, and I don't think we're going to know on election night what the outcome is. Or if we do have a good idea, they're going to throw everything that they have to dispute it. But I think Biden ultimately prevails, whether it be through the courts or through some other means. I think he'll prevail.
There you go, Ryan.
Nestor, we got
this
one more.
optimistic podcast.
We've got one more Palooza coming up. We'll see if Candace is ready to jump ship next time and actually make a prediction.
Go,
I'm Team
Candace.
Candace. I'm
Go,
Team Candace.
Yeah, I'm not there.
I'm always
I'm
Team
not there.
Candace.
Y'all, all I want to say is next time we got to talk about Jamie Harrison. We got to talk about McGrath. We have to talk about because there's going to be all the oxygen for the presidential thing, and that's cool. But as I'm sitting here watching this sham of a Supreme Court situation, I'm watching a president who shouldn't be the president. That had there been a vote or two another way. This time last year at impeachment, we'd be in a whole different state in the country at this point, especially pre-COVID, because the country would have handled it differently. So I don't want to go back into the Wayback Machine, but we talk about these Senate seats all the time and how important they are as we sit here and see this Supreme Court situation. I don't want us to do an hour of this and not have enough oxygen. So next time, let's make sure we carve out a few minutes. Incredible team of people. Elevate Maryland here, Candace Dodson-Reed and Tom Cole. Our dear friend Malia Cromer from up at Goucher keeping us straight and always educating me on the science of things. Lucinda Ware from the campaign of Amy Klobuchar, and I thought of you earlier when we saw her in the Supreme Court nomination procedures, and also Ryan Minor and a minor detail live via satellite from Republican parts unknown Punta Gorda. Say hello to my family down there. How about that?
I will.
Don, I appreciate you. Next time maybe you'll get an El Guapo shirt in the black, not the green.
I can't figure out what's going on here. I didn't get one of the.
He was
shirts.
so upset, guys. He was terribly upset. You should have seen. He looked like he was going to cry when Evan gave me the shirt. Don Mueller is my partner. The all-new Baltimore Positive is live, as well as WNST.net. We're putting it all together. ElectionPalooza III in the books, or is that Roman numeral 3? I'm not sure. We'll go with the IV next time for 4. Absolutely. We appreciate everybody for tuning in. On behalf of Don Mueller, former Baltimore County Executive, I am Nestor Aparicio. On behalf of the whole team, from state to state all the way to Florida, we'll see you on ElectionPalooza 4. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking. Baltimore Positive.